It's something we've heard over and over, and that's new comics today. Comics in 2020. They don't sell as well as the 80s and 90s. And the reason? Politics. Is that true? Hey there, this is Perch. I guess people get more reasons than just politics. Yeah, it's social justice, bad creator behavior. A lot of what's the term? What's the blanket term to describe this? I'm not going to use SJW because I think look when everybody's calling each other that on a nonstop basis, that term has zero meaning. I'm sorry. If you use it and you know what it means, good for you. But when I see like this creator, you're not. It doesn't matter. It's a term that I think is been diluted. I'll just put it that way. I know I'm talking about kind of this blanket things of content, like I think most times there's this umbrella of social issues in comics, forced diversity, the poor, worse creators, quality wise, price. These are all kind of the things that go on. And the problem is this. I think when you're having this discussion around, why don't comics sell better? Why did they sell more in the 80s and the 90s? There's this big elephant in the room that people always ignore. And there's two elephants in that room. One is returnability, and the second is the newsstand. And those two kind of go hand in hand, frankly. I mean, returnability was part of the newsstand, so the direct market didn't have it when it was unveiled. So that's part of what's going on. And the why those are such a big deal is because when people, as we've talked about in the past, there's videos on this, you can go look it up. Um, when people talk about, Jim Shooter would cancel any book that sold under 100,000 copies. Well, first off, that's not entirely factually true. It just is not, just as a fact. But beyond that, there's another piece to it, which is it's not that rule of you have to sell lots of comics was full sell through. In many cases, it was, we had people ordering, say, 280,000 copies of a comic that was going into Safeways and gas stations and everything else. And then 150,000 of those were getting returned. And again, I've done a video on this. The numbers are brutal if you actually look them up of what was actually being sold through and what was being pulped or destroyed or returned. So if you're going to say, hey, the 80s and the 90s sold more than today, you're going to, I think a requirement is you have to use the same numbers. You have to do apples to apples, which means sold through, removing the titles that were returned, removing that metric. You have to calculate that in. Otherwise, you are using phony math. You're using things that are not accurate. And that's just a fact. And so people like to run around, they make that claim, they look like fools, they don't realize it. That's one way you look like a fool. Then once you've actually gotten accurate numbers, which can be very hard to get, the next part of that statement is, okay, well, what are the other factors that are different? Well, the biggest one again is newsstand. There were a lot more places for comics to be sold. Even taking away the returnability, if you have 20 places to sell comics as opposed to 5 places, you're going to sell more comics. Think about it this way. If you're in a shop, in a city, and they've got 10 comic book stores, and then one day 5 of those comic stores close down. Well, the majority of customers are going to migrate to one of the surviving 5. So the same bulk or volume of comics will be sold out of that city. That's a true statement. However, some readers will just vanish. And if you take a bigger scale and you think about, again, the grocery store, the gas station, whatever, wherever the newsstand was, then that number can drop quite a bit because casual shoppers are just not exposed to comics anymore. The spontaneous purchase of a kid buying comics in the grocery store, kids not going to the comic book store, so no comics are being sold. So that number is going to drop. But if you start the conversation around, the 80s and the 90s outsold today, and you don't take this into account, first of all, you're dealing, like I said, you're dealing with phony math. But second, you're attacking the wrong problem. Distribution is the fundamental problem. And then there's a third factor to consider, which is, are we talking about volumes of comics sold, or are we talking about money made? And here's an interesting, I think, almost philosophical debate you can get into with yourself, which is, which would you rather have? 20 comics selling at $1 each, or 5 comics selling at $5 each? Well, if you're doing the quick math, you make more money from selling 5 comics. That's $25 compared to 20. The risk assessment, if you're a business owner, is just saying, hey, but for every customer I lose, that's bad news because my bottom line is getting impacted quite a bit. Here's an ambulance driving by me. Anyway, so that's why you have to take a careful strategy. It's good to raise price and make more profit, for sure. But the more you raise price, the more risk you have when those customers leave you. This is kind of economics 101, but this is an interesting dynamic. So if you're looking at the health of the comic book industry, all right, now you have to ask yourself, it's making more money in some cases than 5 years ago or 10 years ago. It's also charging more. Is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? What do we think about how things have lined up? I think it's it's an important question that we have to ask ourselves. And which kind of money do you want? I think from now, if I step back and I'm again playing economist here, I think it's smarter for comic companies, publishers, to, especially when you have big media attention, big movies coming out, a big pop culture push, now would be the time to go wide. So lower your price and attract more people because that's going to build up your base. I think that's good business strategy. But what I think about business strategy is very different from, is the comics, is the business healthier or unhealthier from the 90s? Well, I can say definitively, anyone who comes and says the mid to late 90s was better off than today is smoking crack. The mid to late 90s were terrible. And from a business perspective, maybe you like the comics during that era. That's fine. That is subjective opinion. And everybody should have that. And I respect your subjective opinion. But from a business standpoint, hell no, the late 90s were not better than today. That is crazy talk. That's just one of the dumbest things you can say in comics. And people do say that all the time. So where does that leave us with where I started this? Is it because of politics? Is it because of woke social justice themes that comics aren't selling? Well, it's hard to say. All the things I've told you about the drop of the newsstand, the lack of returnability, those things are all quantifiable, provable things that we can say, this is why the business is different. This is why there were more volume of comics sold in the 80s than today. Those things were all true. When I get into things like, hey, it's woke politics that's keeping comics from selling, I mean, maybe. It's hard to prove it. That's the problem. We know that comics aren't being sold in Safeway. Is the reason why they're not being sold in Safeway the fact that the politics are woke? Probably not. It's probably business reasons or justifications is why those comics aren't being sold in Safeway. It probably has nothing to do with politics, but maybe. We can have that debate. That'd be an interesting debate to actually have. But so many people, they come to the table positive, certain that the reason why, they basically make two kind of factual errors, which is the comic industry is doing much, 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 much worse than the 80s or 90s. Well, not exactly. Again, not exactly about everything we've just talked about. And then second, they make, on top of that, they say the reason for this failure, this drop in business, is due to, you guessed it, social justice topics. And there, I can only say, it's just hard to prove. Can you say, I don't like the comics because they're now doing social justice? Absolutely. You own that fact. That's you. That's your opinion. You know what you like. You know what you don't like. You should feel very comfortable saying, this is why I'm not buying comics. You are the only one who knows the answer to that. That's your fact, your proof. But in terms of the comic industry as a whole, it's harder to make that case. Again, to be fair, now I think we can say that the comic industry has made several attempts into generating a new audience, a younger audience, a female audience, a this or that audience. We can say that the comic industry has made these attempts, and so far we can see factually by numbers that the numbers aren't growing, that many of these efforts are not succeeding. I think we can definitely say that. I think you can draw a correlation and say, Miss Marvel, when it first came out, exceeded expectations in terms of floppy sales and dramatically exceeded expectations in terms of trade paperback sales, but was not able to hold up those trade paperback sales year after year. There was a decrease. I mean, there's a factual line you can draw that shows that it's not making as much money as it was making. What's the solution to that? Maybe it's double down, make more Miss Marvel. Maybe it's hire a more expensive, well-known, established artist to draw Miss Marvel. Maybe it's, turn Miss Marvel into a terrorist. Who knows what the answer is? Companies will make these business choices and then live with the consequences or successes, whatever it might be. But it's impossible. I mean, you cannot draw a correlation to say, hey, the comic industry is blowing up and it's all because of politics. It's because factually that's not the case. A better statement might be, hey, pop culture and superheroes are blowing up and they're getting really, really popular, and we're not seeing a corresponding growth curve in comic books because they're chasing the wrong audience, or their prices are too high, or the creative talent is not good enough, or the subject matter, i.e. the social politics, are not resonating with readers. I mean, I think you could make that claim, but that's more of you're losing potential in the books as opposed to the whole business is falling apart. That's just the difference in statement. I just said a bunch of things. I don't know if it matters. I mean, the problem I have is that there's YouTube channels that are far bigger than mine who will repeat the talking points day after day after day about, the comic industry is blowing up. Shops are just ejecting themselves into the sky over and over. It's all because Miss Marvel imprisoned children in a comic. I mean, people will say this, and I mean, I'm one voice who has comparatively, very few people listening to me. I wish the talking points would end. I hate them all along. I hate them all directions. I dislike the opposite as well. I dislike Vox does an article. It says Miss Marvel is the most popular Marvel superhero in more than a decade and is more popular than the Avengers, Thor, and Spider-Man ever was. That's complete of absolute garbage. That's a nonsense comment, and I hate it. And I hate it the other direction. I hate the woke Marvel is being outsold by the indies. There's no world where that statement is true. If you want to say that this one crowdfunding comic made more money than this Marvel comic in its own way, you could do that. I think but that's way different statement than saying indie comics are doing better and kicking Marvel's butt financially. You want to say quality wise, again, be my guest. That's your choice to make, and everybody's going to like what they like. I mean, bluntly, for me, I'm a big fan of East to West. That comic just ended. I can say that for me, East of West, an indie comic, kicked Marvel and DC's ass. I can say that for myself. I believe it in my heart and soul. That's how it feels to me. But I would be a complete lunatic if I said that, East of West outsold Marvel and DC. That would be a dumb thing to say because it's just not true. Anyway, I've said a lot of things are going to get a lot of downvotes. You don't go against the establishment, and the establishment can be, frankly, the establishment can be Marvel and DC. The establishment can be YouTube channels with big followings. Those are both, quote unquote, the establishment. And so these, people like to throw out talking points. I'm just saying what I'm saying, and you can believe me, you can not believe me. You can, frankly, go fact check yourself. That's the funny part. Everything I'm saying, you can go actually get actual numbers and look for yourself, and you can see what you want to see. So, oh well, that ended on a downer. Hey, leave me a comment telling me I'm stupid, tell me I'm kissing Marvel's butt, whatever you would like to do. That's all cool. Like, subscribe, downvote. You want to. Follow me on Twitter at Comic Perch. I'm there posting gags and laughs and all kinds of things. Thanks for listening.